What kind of leader unleashes 1 million chickens into the wild? Not tanks, not drones, not pesticides, chickens. When Captain Ibrahim Traoré, the young president of Burkina Faso, announced his plan, the world gasped. To many, it sounded like madness, the desperate move of a leader cornered by crisis. Journalists sneered, calling it a circus. Western commentators laughed, branding it a cheap stunt in a country too poor to afford mistakes. Even within his own circle, whispers rose. Has the captain finally gone too far? But Traoré stood tall before Parliament, his eyes sharp, his voice steady. This is not chaos, he declared. This is strategy. Burkina Faso was bleeding. Its fields, sorghum, millet, maize, were being consumed overnight by plagues of locusts and armies of caterpillars. Farmers who had worked the soil for months watched helplessly as black clouds devoured their future. Entire harvests turned to dust in hours. International organizations promised help, but the help came wrapped in bureaucracy and imported chemicals that poisoned both soil and sovereignty. Traoré refused to kneel. His answer was shocking in its simplicity. Chickens, nature's overlooked army. A single bird can eat hundreds of insects in a single day. Multiply that by 1 million, and suddenly the poorest nation in West Africa held a living biological weapon, an army with feathers instead of uniforms. Yet this gamble was never only about pest control. It was about survival, about sovereignty, about proving that even the most mocked and underestimated nation could craft a solution that was African, natural, and defiant of dependency. For Traoré, every chicken released was more than a pecking beak. It was a soldier against hunger, a provider of eggs, a symbol of independence. So here's the question for you. Is this the boldest act of innovation in Africa's modern history, or the reckless step that could ruin a nation? Because if Traoré's gamble fails, it is not just Burkina Faso that will pay the price. And if he falls, who stands to gain? 1 million chickens. Traoré's gamble that shocked the world. The world had seen strange policies before, but nothing quite like this. A poor, landlocked country at the heart of the Sahel, choosing chickens as its weapon of choice. The announcement alone sent ripples of disbelief across Africa news outlets. But what came next would stun not only journalists, but even seasoned diplomats. Burkina Faso was in crisis. For months, locust swarms had blackened the skies, sweeping across fields of sorghum, millet, and maize. Farmers who had prayed for rain now prayed for survival, as caterpillars devoured what little remained. The losses were staggering, entire harvests reduced to nothing in days. Hunger loomed, and international aid was too slow, too conditional, and too dependent on chemicals imported from abroad. Ibrahim Traoré saw the danger not just in the insects, but in the dependency. He knew that if Burkina Faso surrendered its fields to pesticides from Europe, the country would be shackled once again to foreign suppliers. The soil would be poisoned, the treasury drained, and sovereignty further eroded. To him, the solution had to be African, natural, and sustainable. That solution wore feathers. 1 million chickens, raised, bred, and transported across the country in an operation so massive it rivaled military logistics. Truck convoys loaded with crates of restless birds rumbled through dusty villages. Provincial governors received strict instructions. Distribution must be wide, diverse, and fair. No province left behind. Every community would take part in this feathered revolution. On the appointed day, the spectacle began. In open fields and village squares, trucks pulled up and wooden crates were pried open. Suddenly, A storm of wings and squawks filled the air. Chickens leapt out, scattering in every direction. Children chased them, laughing. Farmers stood silently, torn between amusement and cautious hope. Elders muttered that they had never seen anything like it. And in the capital, international media cameras captured the surreal scene. A government unleashing its new army not of soldiers, but of birds. Critics rushed to their keyboards. Headlines mocked Burkina Faso, chickens versus locusts, Africa's folly, and a nation gone to the birds. The ridicule was swift, almost gleeful. Pundits declared the project a waste of scarce funds. Economists predicted disaster, but Traoré did not flinch. He went before the people, before a skeptical parliament, and said, "Every chicken is a soldier. Every egg is a shield. This is not chaos. This is strategy." For him, it was about far more than pest control. It was about food security. Once the insects were eaten, those same chickens would reproduce, lay eggs, and feed families. What began as pest fighters would become providers of protein. They would multiply, spread, and transform Burkina Faso's countryside into a living cycle of defense and nourishment. Behind the spectacle lay careful calculation. Chickens were cheap compared to pesticides. They were renewable. They turned pests into food. And most importantly, they carried symbolism. To Traoré, the image of chickens flooding the fields would travel further than any policy document. It would tell the world that Burkina Faso was done waiting for foreign solutions. It would show his people that even the smallest nation could innovate boldly. But it was a gamble. If disease spread among the birds, the plan could collapse. If the locusts proved too many, the chickens could be overwhelmed. If farmers rejected the idea, it could turn into political humiliation. Traoré knew the risks, but he also knew the reward: sovereignty and survival. As night fell on the day of the release, the fields of Burkina Faso echoed not with silence, but with the clucks and calls of 1,000,000 new soldiers. The gamble had begun. The world was still laughing, but the farmers of Burkina Faso were watching closely, wondering if those birds scratching in the soil would indeed save their harvests or leave them to ruin. And in that moment, the question that lingered was not about chickens at all. It was about leadership. Could one man, with one shocking gamble, rewrite the destiny of an entire nation? From laughter to shock, did chickens just save Burkina Faso? At first, the world laughed. Headlines in Paris and New York mocked the sight of villagers chasing flapping birds through dusty fields. Commentators smirked, calling it Traoré's poultry parade. On social media, memes spread of chickens wearing helmets, captioned as Burkina Faso's new special forces. To outsiders, it was comic relief from Africa News, another quirky story from a country dismissed as too poor to matter. But within weeks, laughter turned into silence, and silence into shock. Reports from rural provinces began to emerge. Farmers who had once lost half their crops to locust swarms were now reporting far less damage. Fields that had been stripped bare were recovering, the grain surviving long enough to be harvested. Villagers spoke with awe. The chickens eat from sunrise to sunset. The locusts scatter when they come. For the first time in years, families were bringing home sacks of grain instead of empty hands. And it was not only the crops. Markets that had struggled to provide basic food suddenly saw an abundance of eggs. Prices dropped, protein intake increased, and malnutrition among children began to decline. For rural mothers who had long struggled to put a single source of protein on the family table, the chickens were no longer a joke. They were salvation. International correspondents returned to the villages they had once filmed with irony. Their new footage looked different. Instead of mocking tones, the cameras now captured cautious hope. Aerial shots showed fields green again. Interviews revealed children laughing with yolk-stained smiles after eating their first egg in weeks. The circus of chickens had started to look like a miracle, and with the changing winds came political consequences. Critics inside Parliament who had accused Traoré of wasting money found themselves cornered. Farmers spoke openly on radio programs. This president did not wait for Europe to save us. He gave us chickens, and we survived. Opposition voices struggled to find traction against testimonies so raw and powerful. Every cluck in the countryside was a reminder that the young captain had dared and won. The international reaction was just as telling. In Mali, Niger, and Chad, delegations quietly crossed borders to study the program. What they found astonished them. Crop losses in zones with chickens had dropped by as much as 40% compared to control areas. African leaders who had scoffed now leaned closer, wondering if their own nations could copy the model. Meanwhile, Western think tanks scrambled to adjust. Reports that had once called the policy unsustainable now admitted there might be lessons in community-driven ecological resilience. Universities sent students to study the impact. European newspapers began publishing articles with a new tone. Could Burkina Faso's chickens hold the answer to Africa's food crisis? What had begun as ridicule was now becoming respect. And for Ibrahim Traoré, the shift was not just policy, it was power. He had turned a national gamble into an international conversation. He had proven that sovereignty could be feathered, loud, and utterly unexpected. But here is the part that matters most. This was only the beginning. The real storm was still to come, because every success brought with it bigger risks, louder opposition, and higher stakes. Would the chickens continue to deliver, or would the gamble collapse under its own weight? If you want to follow the twists of this story, from ridicule to reverence, from eggs to empire, then stay with us. Subscribe now, because the next chapter of Burkina Faso's chicken revolution will leave you even more stunned. When chickens became politics, the fallout in Burkina Faso. The release of 1 million chickens was never only about insects. It reshaped society, altered politics, and redrew the lines of power inside Burkina Faso. What began as an ecological gamble quickly evolved into a social earthquake. In the villages, something extraordinary happened. Farmers who had long felt invisible to distant governments suddenly felt seen. For decades, rural communities accused politicians in Ouagadougou of forgetting them, of hoarding power in the capital while the countryside starved. But when crates of chickens arrived not from foreign aid agencies but from their own government, the message was unmistakable. This time, the state was fighting for them. Elders told radio stations, "No one has ever given us such a tool. These chickens are our soldiers, our food, our future." The language of ownership spread like wildfire. Traoré understood this shift. By decentralizing distribution, handing chickens through local councils rather than ministries, he avoided the trap of corruption and favoritism. Communities themselves managed the release, and with it came a new sense of agency. The move also empowered women in ways no one had expected. By mandating that nearly a third of the chickens go to women-led households, Traoré ignited a quiet revolution. Suddenly, women in villages controlled assets that reproduced, traded, and fed families. Markets began to see more female sellers, more women negotiating prices, more mothers holding economic power. Politically, the gamble became untouchable. Opposition parties that tried to mock the program as wasteful were drowned out by farmers' testimonies. Each accusation of mismanagement was countered with stories of families eating eggs for the first time in months, of fields spared from ruin. Radio programs brimmed with voices defending the president. These chickens saved us. They belong to the people, not to politicians. To attack the program was to attack the survival of the countryside, and that was political suicide. In Parliament, critics grew frustrated. They argued that costs were unsustainable, that chickens could not replace serious governance. Yet each argument rang hollow against the living evidence scratching in the fields. For the first time in years, rural voters rallied behind the government, praising a leader who risked ridicule to defend their survival. But beneath the optimism lurked tension. The very success of the program consolidated power around Traoré. His opponents began whispering about authoritarian tendencies, about a leader using chickens not just to fight pests, but to cement control. Western diplomats, uncomfortable with the program's popularity, questioned whether Traoré was building a cult of personality feather by feather. Aid agencies, sidelined and embarrassed, quietly reduced their involvement, claiming lack of coordination. The symbolism of chickens spread beyond food and farms. It became a political shield. No rival could touch it without alienating the very people they needed to win. Yet the more untouchable the program became, the more it raised a troubling question. Had Traoré found a path to unite his people, or a tool to rule them without challenge? The chickens were no longer just clucking in the fields. They were echoing in Parliament, in foreign embassies, and in the halls of power. And as the opposition scrambled for relevance, the stakes only grew higher. Did chickens just shake Washington? The world reacts to Traoré's gamble. When news of Burkina Faso's feathered revolution reached Washington, the reaction was far from laughter. What had begun as a meme was now creeping into intelligence briefings. Analysts at the Pentagon and the State Department debated what it meant when a poor nation dared to defy conventional wisdom and succeeded. For American policymakers, the shock was not about chickens. It was about the narrative. Traoré had turned a desperate agricultural crisis into a symbol of sovereignty. By rejecting imported pesticides and choosing a homegrown solution, he was sending a message that rippled across Africa. We will solve our problems our way. That was dangerous. Not because chickens threatened U.S. security, but because ideas do. If one young leader could inspire millions with 1 million birds, what might others attempt tomorrow? European capitals felt the sting even more. France, the former colonial power, watched uneasily as Traoré mocked dependency on Western aid. Parisian newspapers once ridiculed him, but soon had to report that crop yields were stabilizing, markets were thriving, and neighboring countries were studying Burkina Faso's approach. Each success chipped away at France's influence in the Sahel, a region it once dominated militarily and economically. For Paris, the chickens were not just livestock, they were rebellion. In Beijing, the tone was different. Chinese state media highlighted the story as proof of African innovation, a subtle jab at Western dependency models. China offered veterinary support and cheap grain for feed, seeing an opportunity to strengthen ties with Ouagadougou. Moscow, too, quietly applauded, framing Traoré's gamble as part of the global shift toward multipolarity. The message was simple. If Burkina Faso could chart its own path, so could others. The African Union watched with fascination. Leaders from Mali, Niger, and Chad sent observers and returned with glowing reports. At regional summits, speeches began to echo Traoré's defiant rhetoric. Why must we wait for loans? Why must we poison our land? If chickens can defend Burkina Faso, then Africa can defend itself. What had begun as one nation's gamble was mutating into a continental slogan. In Washington, officials grew nervous. Aid agencies feared losing relevance. Think tanks warned that if the chicken strategy spread, Western influence in Africa would wane further. Yet publicly, UN diplomats praised Burkina Faso's community-led resilience, careful not to appear dismissive. The irony was sharp. The world's most powerful